Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Open Democracy's weekly live discussion. My name is Nandini Archer and I'm based in London, and I'm Open Democracy's global commissioning editor. I work mainly on the gender team, and I'm very excited for today's discussion. We want this conversation to involve as many of you as possible. So particularly thank you to all of those who submitted your questions and comments ahead of time. We're going to address as many of them as we can. And if you're joining on Zoom and you have a question or a comment for us, click on the chat icon in the bottom of your screen and type into that chat window. And people watching on Facebook, if you can put your questions in comments, I will be able to see those as well. And we say this every week, but sorry for any distractions and weird noises or random sounds. We're doing this we've been doing these panels for about a year now, every week, largely from our homes, so you never know what will crop up. The title of today's discussion is, how do we fight systemic racism in the UK when the government denies it exists? So we have a really wonderful panel for you all today, some real celebrities, and so let me introduce them. First of all, we have Kemi Akinola, CEO of Be Enriched and Brixton People's Kitchen, and councillor in Wandsworth, London. We're also joined by Kehinde Andrews, Professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University, Chair of Harambee Organisation of Black Unity, Editor-in-Chief of Make It Plain, and author of The New Age of Empire. We have Marcus Ryder, Executive Producer of new media Caixin Global, visiting professor at the Sir Lenny Henry Centre for Media Diversity at Birmingham City University, author of Access All Areas, the Diversity Manifesto for TV and Beyond. And last but not least, and I'm hoping she'll be able to join soon, she's slightly late, but it's also really exciting. We have Halima Begum, who is Chief Executive of the Runnymede Trust, and has also been leading some of the response to this race report, so she can tell us about that shortly. Okay, so to get started, Open Democracy is a global media outlet. So for those of you calling from outside of the UK, or those in the UK and for some reason haven't heard, last week a controversial UK report on racism was released by the government. It was commissioned after Black Lives Matter protests last year. And it has concluded that Britain should be regarded as a model for other white majority countries. And so since its publication, of course, there's been widespread criticism and outrage, and that's what we're here to talk about today. And I'll leave it to my great panelists really to delve in deeper and tell us more. And so I'm going to look through some of the audience questions so far. And so Kehinde, big question really to kick us off. What's your reaction to this report? Why has it got so many people's backs up? And what is it in particular about this report which is so offensive?
Everything. I mean, I think the thing with this report is we all knew it was going to be bad, right? When they picked Tony Sewell, who spent the last 20, 25 years saying institutional racism doesn't exist, and pointing out really quite racist cultural arguments around why you have these racial disparities. Not really surprising you get a report that basically does what he's been doing for the last 25 years. And the government could have asked, we have Halima Begum here from the Runnymede Trust. There's many, many, many experts on issues of race and racism. They picked a bunch of institutional racism deniers to deny institutional racism. Who's surprised, right? The only one surprised is just how bad it is. I mean, I have to say, like, it's spectacularly bad, which I think is why it's caused so much uproar. Like, just the idea that institutional racism doesn't exist, for one, it's kind of a settled issue, I think. I mean, even Tory governments have acknowledged this with the Lamy Review and the Race Disparities Audit. So I think to kind of go so far backwards, and then some of the language used around slavery, genetics is even in there, the cultural arguments. I mean, it just is really, and the more you read it, the worse it gets. So I think people are rightly offended because it is propaganda. It isn't a genuine attempt to do anything other than, this is a piece of the culture wars. It is not a serious document.
Great, thank you. And so another question for our audience, for Marcus, you argued that kind of racism is alive and well in the UK media industry, but too often it's easily denied. Why do you think that racism is so difficult to pinpoint at times and describe?
I don't think it's difficult to pinpoint or describe. You just need to look at the stats. If 2% of television directors are people of color, that's racism, right? These things do not happen by chance. Similarly, we're talking about race, but if you look at gender, if something like 15% of film directors are women, that's sexism. Unless you believe that men are somehow intrinsically better at directing films, or white people are somehow naturally gifted at being television directors, right? If you have such large disparities, there has to be a reason, right? And that reason is either that there's something culturally or wrong with us, which seems to be what the report alludes to, sometimes doesn't even allude to, actually just states, or there's racism at play, right? And if it's happening on such a large scale, which it is in the media industry, then it's structural racism, and it's systemic racism. And so it's not that difficult to pinpoint. What is sometimes difficult to pinpoint is where in the structures and what parts of those structures the racism lies, and what are the best ways to address that racism, right? But having said that, even when I say, I'm even being a little kinder on saying it's difficult to pinpoint, there are lots of people. I see that there's certain people on here. There's Terry a lot who's here, who's been talking about diversity tax breaks. There's the Lenny Henry Centre, who have put forward policy solutions. So we've identified a lot of the issues. We've identified where those barriers are. We've identified solutions. So even with them, it's not that difficult. It's not that difficult. We know what the solutions are. We know what the problems are. We can solve it if we want to.
Great, thank you. So another question from our audience, and this one's for Kemi. Looking at this report, and Kehinde, you talked about this briefly as well. Does it actually matter? Like, do we need the government on our side? I know you, Kemi, are involved in lots of exciting grassroots groups. The question from the audience is, aren't they already doing the job of fighting racial injustice anyway? So should we be wasting our time talking about this report at all?
Are the government already doing things about racism, do you mean?
No, I mean, like, grassroots groups are already doing things about racism. So does it matter? Like, do we need the government on our side is the question.
Well, a lot of my projects focus around food and food insecurity, and often, because that's been quite a big thing during this whole COVID crisis, I think it's a really good analogy that the government have kind of left a lot of these community groups, including the stuff that I do, to kind of pick up and do all the work that the government really should be doing, where it should be led by policy and led by government. So yes, it does matter, and they should be doing this work. It shouldn't be left to people, just on the ground who are trying to pick up the pieces, who are trying to encourage people to essentially not be racist. It definitely should be led by policy itself.
Great, thank you. And hi, Halima. Glad that you're able to join us. One of the questions that came through for you was, so have you ever witnessed a government report quite like this, that's quite this bad?
Depends how old we are, right? Oh, yes. Hang on, the answer was no, but if I was alive in 1968 and maybe saw some of the awful stuff from Enoch Powell and that generation, then the answer would be different. But I'm about 47, so I must say, this is probably the worst one I've seen in the last 25 years. And what's really interesting about me is that when I was 21, I left university, not so bright young thing, but certainly young, and I wanted to join the race relations cause. And I joined the Runnymede Trust. So I started actually at the Runnymede Trust when I was 21 on a commission report back then. And we looked at all those issues, and you were right, Kehinde, many others have looked at these issues, and I feel as though, oh my God, this is like Groundhog's Day. We've gone back, but come out in a kind of another world altogether. So it's one thing just going around a loop, but it's quite another to come out to another dystopia where, as you were saying, things that we took for granted in the last 25 years around what we understand to mean as racism versus what is now systemic. I mean, that was quite an understanding to get to, quite a journey to get to. But now we're looking at a government appointed commission that's saying, we think that racism exists, and yeah, we've kind of looked at institutional racism, but we're not sure we see it enough, or we saw the evidence. That's quite shocking, actually. I mean, that to me is shocking, and it's more shocking not because it's coming from a government-appointed commission, but because it seems to be suggesting that those of us who are in authority, in a position of power, seem to live in another world altogether from where the public is, because the public understands quite what racism is structurally. We've got Harry and Meghan talking about structural racism. If you've got that family talking about structural racism, how is it that the government-appointed commission that's supposed to look at ethnic disparities can't figure it out? So that's a shocking element, I would say, and that must mean, therefore, that this is about a cultural war rather than an evidence or policy-led commission. And I think, Kehinde, you're right. This isn't about fact or evidence or policy. This is culture war posturing.
Yeah, great, thank you. And so one of the other a lot of people had questions around the government, and so obviously we kind of have a relatively diverse Conservative cabinet. The report was carried out by people of colour. One of the questions was, what does this say about having brown and black faces in high places? And Kehinde, I'll go to you first.
It should tell us everything we need to know, that diversity is not a solution to the problem. I mean, this isn't. I mean, like, we can make arguments that you need diversity, but if you think that diversity solves racism, then this should be the final nail in that coffin. One, the government is the most diverse government we have had ever. Certainly the most racist government in my lifetime. If you look at the immigration policies, look at the policing bill that's going to make defacing a statute a higher penalty for that than rape. This government's awful. I mean, it isn't a coincidence they've had two Asian home secretaries while pushing through this immigration policy. So in some ways, having this panel of a collective of black and brown people whose only credential to talk about race and ethnicity seems to be they're black and brown and don't believe in institutional racism, kind of tells you that the diversity thing is a bit of an issue. Not that we shouldn't have diversity, but that you can't expect that to be the thing that changes structural racism. And one of the things I always stress here is that this is not a new thing, right? So the people who administered the British Empire were hugely diverse, right? At the Amritsar massacre, which is the anniversary soon, right? The number of the troops, there was diverse troops who shut down a bunch of innocent children, men, women, and children in India. So there's always been this idea that you can have diversity within the administration of white supremacy, but that doesn't actually mean dealing with any of the issues. And I think this is just a good reminder of that. Thank
you. So we've had lots of comments as well saying that, yeah, of course, this report is ultimately a distraction. What we need to talk about now is how to actually achieve anti-racism. And so, Halima, could you tell us a bit more about this open letter that you've been coordinating, and specifically what you're calling for? And someone from the audience had also asked earlier whether you think it will be successful or if you're feeling hopeful about it.
Thank you, Nandini. That's actually one of the reasons why I was late, because we're still coordinating kind of behind the scenes action to land this open letter to number 10 Downing Street with a bit of a mobilization going behind it. And I was late because I got a very last minute article draft from the Times to look at about what Runnymede Trust is doing in relation to this open letter. And I can tell you it wasn't a very nice thing to read. So be prepared to read a full-on attack on the Runnymede Trust in the next couple of days from that newspaper. That's what happens when you organize something constructive, calm. As you can see, I'm not this angry person that you can dismiss on the streets, because only angry people complain. Not that there's anything wrong with being angry, by the way, but there is something going on about the caricaturing of this opposition and our reaction as a national public response, and that is all deliberate. Will it work? Well, we thought quite hard about what that response should be, and we've been listening to the public, we've been listening to the experts, we've been listening to grassroots organizations, and for 10 years we've had the evidence and the reports from a whole range of stakeholders to demonstrate both direct racism and indirect racism and structural racism. And we you know, we knew that they wouldn't really take it seriously, but we still engaged constructively, because you still have to engage constructively. To your point, does it matter whether government is on side or not? Yes, it does matter, because if you're doing well on your own, you'll do fine. But if you do well with government support, you'll go a lot further. So yes, we do need government on board. So we wanted to engage with them. We didn't want to boycott the commission. And naturally, you know, the result was what it was. So we thought hard about what that response should be, and that response shouldn't be personal. It shouldn't be focused on the individual. It shouldn't be focused on just emotion and reaction. It should be focused on substantive points that we want the Prime Minister to reaffirm. And what were those substantive points? If we move beyond the reaction, what we're looking at is possibly a dress rehearsal for something to follow. Because obviously a report by itself isn't that dangerous, it's what's behind it that's dangerous. Like if there were policy responses to follow from it, that's dangerous. Or if there was something behind it from Liz Truss, the Equalities Minister, or from Priti Patel, who's responsible for immigration policies. If that's what's behind it, I'd be very, very worried about this. So that's why we put the open letter together, and we wanted to bring together a whole coalition of voices. It wasn't about the Runnymede Trust, it wasn't about Windrush campaigns, it wasn't about charities. So what it was about all of us being united to say, look, this isn't on, enough is enough, and let's think about another way to move forward. Even if they don't listen, I think it's important for the public will to be demonstrated, and that's why we did it. And I just wanted to say something about your question about, you know, does it matter if you've got a diverse leadership in place? Well, I would say that actually proves the case of structural racism, doesn't it? Because the whole point about structural racism is that it's not an individual action, it's not an individual responsibility. The reason why we have disproportionate outcomes is that there's something about the system that's stacking up, producing bad outcomes. If it was just about the individual, then I think it would actually be easy. So the very fact that you have the most diverse leadership in this country doesn't mean that you don't have racism. It proves my point, I think. So I actually think that is a case in point, that structural racism exists despite the best individual will, because it's not about the individual intention, it is about how the system itself can be working against us. So I kind of think we should kind of take the argument there, rather than just saying it's about one individual who heads up the Home Office or another individual who heads up another part of the government. Will it work? Well, we need more people to sign. I mean, the open letter closes tonight at midnight. Please sign. The very fact that we're having a national conversation around enough is enough and a pushback, I think that's quite effective. The Prime Minister has already distanced himself, and day by day we see a different manoeuvre from the Prime Minister and Lumberton. So I think we are being effective.
Great, thank you, Halima. And yeah, sorry to hear about that pushback. I see lots of people in the chat, and one person saying, you know, you're on the right side if your enemy is Murdoch. So I think, so another question for you, Kemi, was around specifically the fact that it seems that the Tory party is really trying to reposition itself as the party of the working classes. Do you think that this is part of an attempt to make sure that Labour is never able to win back the so-called red wall and being part of the culture wars in that aspect?
I'm supposed to give a long answer to that question, but yes, I mean, they're politicians. Labour and Tory are politicians, and of course the Tories are trying to do that. They, you know, they want to move like the headquarters up to the red wall for exactly that reason. This is what politicians do. I also saw in the chat somewhere that someone mentioned, is it a surprise that this just came out just before the local elections? Nothing is ever by accident. It's always intentional, and it's with the intention normally of discrediting the other side and the opposition, which is something that you know will find in. Are we allowed to talk about Sadiq? Bless him. But you know, I'm sure people will try and discredit that young man as much as possible. But then who do they have? They have an idiot on the other side. So hopefully he doesn't win. But yes, is the answer.
Great, thank you. Okay, so some more questions from the audience about specifically what can be done. So we've also had a lot of questions about social movements, and I'll let anyone answer, whoever wants to answer this one. How excited were you about the direct action of state school students, such as those at Pimlico Academy, and also movements like Black Lives Matter? Are these the only ways forward? The question.
I mean, I'll just jump in and say yes, probably. I mean, I think, in fact, I've actually come around to actually quite liking the report. I mean, it's so bad and it's such a nakedly, obviously terrible, that the response has been really heartwarming, right? Like, people have come out and said Britain's racist. You've got people mobilizing around this, and in some ways, it is better than, like, slightly controversial take here, but the Macpherson report, which acknowledges institutional racism, changes the law, and then gives us this framework, which actually means you can't actually address any actual issues of institutional racism, may actually be more damaging, right? Because one of the problems is that when we start to accept things which actually really limit us, and then we really get trapped. But this is so bad that I think we've all realized that you can't rely on the government for things, and we then have to organize for ourselves. So I think this is actually, that reaction is one of the good things that's come out of the report.
Not sure I quite agree with you there.
I was going to say.
I mean, it's a bit like saying, you know, when somebody finally beat up my best friend, that's when I decided to actually jump in and start the fight. You know, I mean,
wherever it takes.
Okay, I'm really not sure. You know, I get that. I get the, you know, I think, I can't remember which pope it was that said that evil is just unfinished good, you know, and so you can take a philosophical approach to all these things, you know, or you could even take the approach that the commission takes, which is slavery was a way of making Black people better. If you want to take that approach, you can, but I'm not sure that that is the approach that I would want to take. I think the problem with the report is that, don't get me wrong, it is great that there is pushback. It is great that people are mobilizing. But what this report does, which we didn't have previously, is that it legitimizes a very fringe perspective. Previously, the idea that there was not institutional racism was a fringe perspective. And when it was voiced, it was seen as being fringe to the right? And now, even if the report disappears, the idea that you can say that there isn't institutional racism is no longer a fringe perspective, right? And that is what's worrying, right? Post Macpherson, right? The idea of anybody who is in the state, in government, in public institutions, denying institutional racism, as you said, Kehinde, at the start, it was more or less a settled argument, right? It is now unsettled, even if we know no longer, even if we think the report's mad, even if people are pushing against it, it has been given, the idea that there isn't institutional racism has been given a legitimacy, which is why we have to push against it, right? Which is why we have to, why it's so important that we try and restate and reaffirm the framework that was there and the justifications that were there. Otherwise, you know, we will have to repeat what was happening in the 80s and in the 90s. You know, so that's why I'm not sure I really agree with you, Kehinde, with regards to Macpherson. How Macpherson report was implemented might be problematic. Absolutely, it definitely wasn't a perfect solution, but it gave us an intellectual framework and it gave a legitimacy to the idea that institutional racism exists, right? And over the last 21 years, that argument has progressed and has been completely accepted by up to Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, right? And what we had last week was a massive pushback against that and a legitimizing of the idea that it doesn't exist. And that for me is the most damaging thing about the report. Even if nothing else happens with the report, that for me is the most damaging and worrying thing about the report.
Can I just jump in there and just to say I'm not entirely sure that any of the children in Pimlico School will have read the race report, but I do feel that everything that has happened over the past year, starting maybe even with the young people striking for climate change, and then the Black Lives Matter, definitely has provided young people with a way that they can see that they can have a voice. And I think I was really proud of these young people. I know they're just over the other side of the river, but I'm going to count them as part of the South London young people. And I was just very proud that they felt that they could, because it wasn't just the Black kids that were standing up for their rights. It was all of the kids. And I think that's really brilliant that they managed to do that. And young people now feel that, even if it is protest and not going to school, which might all seem like fun, but that they feel that they can push back on any institution such as school, and actually give themselves a voice and win as well, which is excellent. And I'm very, very proud of them. Hopefully schools in the future won't make such bad decisions.
Great, thank you. So I found even more questions, which is really great. One of them is to you, Kehinde. Could you give an opinion on the report's lack of empiricism specifically? So yeah, does it basically academically stand up? I think you touched on this before.
No. I mean, no. I mean, look, it's terrible. Like, in terms of a piece of work, it was submitted to me on my first year, it would fail. It's just bad. It misuses data, misrepresents data, makes massive jumps that make no sense given the context. Actually, one of the charts has this really good description of racism in schools, and they just ignore the bit about A-levels to focus on GCSEs, because GCSEs paints a better picture for them, right? I mean, it really is bad. And even just conceptually. So it's very clear they never read anything about institutional racism, because if they did, they would understand that what they're actually describing is the kind of definition of institutional racism. I mean, I think one of the things I just push back a little bit on this is that if you actually look at what's happened in the last 10 years, the kind of institutional racism framework was already being unpicked. I mean, you have the Equality Human Rights Commission, who won't use the term institutional racism or structural racism. So this was already brewing, and what you have here is a really clear example of it. But this isn't like a new thing. This really has been happening for the last 10 years, I'd say. Since we've had that equality, human rights shift into this, it's kind of post 2010 Tory government. So this has been coming, I think. But yeah, this, in terms of, is what I really want to stress. This is not a credible landmark piece of anything. It does not prove anything. It is a terrible piece of work that is essentially propaganda and shouldn't be treated seriously as evidence of anything, honestly.
Okay, great, thank you. And another question, this is open to anyone. How are we going to go about changing the BAME tag? Do we think this is offensive?
Don't use it. Sorry, that's the end of my response.
I don't think it's as simple as that. So go ahead, Halima.
Marcus, I was going to say, somebody will figure out what we should be called, but I don't want to be drawn into a conversation about terminology, because that is exactly what they want you to do. The only good thing to come out of this was that, oh, they got us talking about what we describe ourselves as. I think that's probably a low-hanging fruit.
Right, yeah. Were you going to say anything else, Marcus?
Yeah, I don't think it's as the idea of not describing ourselves as BAME. I think it's complex. It's to do with the specificity with regards to what we're trying to describe, and it's the misuse of the term. You're not having a similar debate in America about the term people of color, right? And that's to do with the specificity of how the term is used and implemented. So it's about the misuse of the term, right, and not about the term itself, right? And so I think that if we get too worked up with BAME, it's actually about the policy misuse and abuse of the term rather than the term in and of itself. Otherwise, you would be seeing the same pushback with people of color or other collective terms in the US or in other majority white countries where there are Black people, right? And so there is no doubt that there is power in having a collective term. There's no doubt that there is also danger in having a collective term if it is misused, right? But terms are used and abused. And so we should be looking at how terms are actually used and abused rather than getting too worked up with the actual term itself.
I mean, I think just to jump in here, I think conceptually there is an issue, because if you look at the way BAME is misused mostly, it is to lump everybody together. And actually, this is kind of what they've done in the data many times, to just kind of, like, for example, that GCSE statistic, where if you look at it and say white, non-white, there's no problem, there's no racism. So it really is important conceptually and analytically to look at the different groups, because we're not all the same, right? And we have different histories and different realities. And so I think that's why people get annoyed about the term BAME. Not just about the term, actually how it's used, because you really do have to look at the different experiences, different groups. It really is important to get a proper understanding of what's happening.
Yes, but if you go down that road, right? If you look at, I have no problem with the term black, right, for obvious reasons, right? But if you then go down the road of looking at the experience of Black Caribbean and Black African, right, especially if you're looking at educational achievements, there are differences there as well. There are similarities, but there are differences there. There are definitely differences and divergences with regards to the Asian experience, the South Asian experience, the East Asian experience, right? And so definitely, right, if you're lumping everyone together, there will always be problems, right? And any term used in any categorization that you use will have problems. And so what it is about is it's about the specificity of how you use the term and in which context. In some contexts, it will be relevant, and in some contexts, it will be wildly irrelevant, right? And so it's how it's used and making sure it's not abused, right? But the idea that there is not any utility to have a collective term for people of color or non-white people, right? That seems to fly in the face of revolutionary struggles against colonialism, right, dating back for hundreds of years, right? And so I would be, and it also flies in the face of other countries, right, such as America, such as Canada, right, which have used collective terms for non-white people, right? And so it's about the abuse of the term, right, and making sure that we use the collective term when appropriate, and making sure we don't use it when it's not appropriate.
Yeah, I don't want to go the whole debate about BAME, but
do you know what I mean? We can do like 2 days of whether to call ourselves BAME or politically black or Indian or Muslim. I do think there are bigger issues to deal with this race report, and I think that it's a low-hanging fruit. We all know there are different ways to get to specificity. We all know it's not perfect, but there are fundamental issues that this report got wrong, and we need to focus on that. And that's, that's back to what Marcus was saying. Why is it that we've moved on from institutional racism, or we seem to be in such a hurry to move on but not even check it? I mean, there's a reason for that. And Marcus, I'm looking to you right now as a lawyer.
No, that's my brother. That's not me.
Oh, it's your brother. I'm so sorry. Yeah, but you made the point about institutional racism, right? Now, this is what's really, really substantially wrong with this report. It's not that there's academic flaws in there, Kehinde. I mean, there's so many. We could talk to length about the data, what's there or not there. I could even tell you about the ethnicity pay gap and what's wrong there. But what's fundamentally wrong at a bigger level for me is the fact that, if you look at where we are on the equalities legislation, or with the Equalities Act 2010, we almost got to a place where we can discuss the public sector duty on equalities, which takes you a little bit closer to institutional racism in this country. Although in the public discourse it's existed since the murder of Stephen Lawrence, and for 25 years we've tried to make this more understood, as a legal term within the criminal justice system, it hasn't landed there. And that's one of the reasons why the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, when it came to looking at the wrongs from Windrush, for example, while they could say that the Home Office had acted in a wrongful way and didn't uphold the public sector equality duty, it couldn't go far enough to say, and this was institutional racism. And I tell you the reason they gave. They said, well, because institutional racism doesn't exist as a legal concept in your court of law, so how are you going to hold anybody to account in a court of law on institutional racism? That's where the problem lies. And if this report had actually given more credibility to institutional racism, then your law courts will be compelled to look at what this looks like in terms of accountability legally. That's what's really frightening. And for me, when I said, look, what's behind this report, I'm wondering, is a dress rehearsal about going back to our equalities legislation and taking it down back to the 1960s, where Patrick Vernon has said there was a colour bar, Halima? Are we moving away from outcomes and structures back to equal access? Do you know what I mean? That's what's really frightening. And I remain very worried about this. And that is why in that open letter, we want the Prime Minister to reaffirm whether the existing legislation that protects us in terms of access and outcomes is still there, or is there another intention behind that? And we all know what Liz Truss and Priti Patel and our Prime Minister are capable of. They're capable of a lot of revision very quickly.
Any responses to that? Any other thoughts off the back of what Halima's said?
Yeah, I just add, I mean, the report is part of the government's response to Black Lives Matter. And it has been very consistent. There is no problem. The schools aren't racist. Let's support the police. This is just part of that. And so we shouldn't just focus on the report. It very much is what is the government's agenda. And I think all the evidence is pretty clear. The government's agenda is deeply nefarious. And this is a government that has a huge majority have unchecked power for the next 4 years. So it should actually frighten us, because I dread to think that the things that are coming down the line, not even as a result of the report, because whether with the report or not, this was kind of, the report was commissioned to give them license to do it, but they were always going to do it. And yeah, it is deeply worrying what comes next.
One of the questions from the audience was about overall, to all panelists, do you feel, obviously this is like a lot of people feel extremely gaslighted and angry, but do you feel optimistic or pessimistic? Do you think that the report will ultimately go down in history? Obviously there's been such a big kind of backlash to it, but so do you think that we will recover from this?
Recover from this in what way?
I think the question was specifically about how Doreen Lawrence had said that this risks taking the fight for racial justice back 20 years. So do you feel kind of optimistic? Do you feel like that will be the case, basically?
You know, so I'm often campaigning for media diversity and trying to increase representation and inclusion and for the media. I remember being disheartened when Tim Davie, who's the Director General of the BBC, said that there was no institutional racism at the BBC. And so I remember being disheartened, and he said that when he first took office. So I was disheartened about that. And what worries me, and at that point, people didn't really pay too much attention to it. And it disheartens me that you then have a report like this, which basically legitimizes that perspective of people, whether it's Cressida Dick, whether it's Tim Davie, looking at their own institutions, and despite the outcomes of those institutions, you know, the BBC, you know, thinks that the N-word, until there's a public outcry, thinks that the N-word is fine to broadcast, and actually doubles down, thinks the N-word is fine to broadcast at breakfast television. The BBC thought it was absolutely fine to, you know, discipline Naga Munchetty for pointing out that a tweet which the entire world seemed to think was racist, pointing out that it was racist, right? And so what disheartens me is that the idea that the lead of the BBC or the person who's in charge of the Metropolitan Police or other really important public institutions, when they come out with the idea that their organizations are not institutionally racist, despite all the statistics proving that there is a serious problem systemically within those organizations, this report gives it legitimacy. You know, this report gives those positions legitimacy. So we have to fight back against this report. We have to fight back against that position, right? Because unless we do, then the heads of other important public institutions will be able to say the same and implement, and more importantly, implement policies or not implement policies which will be detrimental to Black people, Asian people, you know, yeah. So yeah, it is concerning.
Thank you. And I see one of the questions in the chat was whether there is scope for Runnymede and others to put together an alternative independent version of this report. And then Halima, you've helpfully shared a link to the Runnymede report that you wrote very shortly before, right? Anticipating this.
Can I ask a question
Mm-hmm.
to my other panelists? What did you think about the recommendations?
The 20 or 21 recommendations. Yeah, that's the test question as well, by the way. Have we actually seen each and every one of them? Yes, we have, because we are so publicly out there. The one I was really, there was two that I was worried about, actually, or two conclusions and data sets that were quite worrying. The first one was around education and the fact that some minority groups are doing better and others are not, and then the cultural tropes behind that. So therefore, these hard-working, work-ethic minorities are doing really well at school, and there are others that are not doing so well at school. That those facts are statistically not correct. Kehinde, you were saying that you can pick the education data to show different things. And the one cultural war, data war that's playing at the moment is a run around white working class boys being left behind, so to speak. And we know that the groups that are being left behind are actually Gypsy, Romany, traveller children in many ways, but they are not named as white working class children. And if anything, even that figure around white working class children is quite misleading, because it takes just the proportion of children who are on free school meals rather than all children in school. So it is very misleading. The other one that's really misleading is the ethnicity pay gap data. So I don't know how many of you have checked the data, but what it does is it lumps the Irish figure with ethnic minorities. And don't get me wrong, Irish people have suffered historic racism, quite rightly so, they are in the right category. But the ethnicity pay gap for Irish people is 40% higher than the national average. But for Pakistanis and Bangladeshis is 10 to 15% lower than the national average. So of course, it looks like the ethnicity pay gap has been narrowed because you've got white Irish people in the same category as Pakistani Uber drivers and Bangladeshi Uber drivers. And of course, there are Indian and Chinese professionals who are doctors, so it sort of doesn't make sense, but it is not true that it's white people who are left behind in terms of earnings. It's just not true. But the recommendation that is most worrying for me is the one around education and the national curriculum, the one where they've attempted to set up another panel to look at the curriculum. And we've all been campaigning for a more diverse curriculum, as you know. And what we hope to see is a better reflection of colonialism, empire, our own contribution to the British story and all of that. And we've been making a lot of progress on this. But they've appointed an expert panel to look into that. And that expert panel includes some very good people, but some other people who also deny institutional racism. So how is it that they're going to come up with an inclusive curriculum that reflects that rich experience that we want to see? And they've already gone down the wrong path by suggesting that they can rewrite the curriculum. And I won't repeat what they said, but they simply didn't understand the kind of sentiment and feeling behind what it is that's missing from the national curriculum. So that the education one was really worrying. And of course, they kind of didn't really address the Windrush points at all. They kind of alluded to it, but they didn't really go there. They thought that if you just look at the national curriculum, then Windrush will be answered. No, Windrush was a systematic structural racism issue. You need to have recommendations within the Home Office to deal with that. So there's so many things weak with it, and it just didn't go far enough. I could go on, there were 20, but maybe my other co-panelists want to contribute.
I mean, I would just say that if you don't recognize institutional racism, then you're not going to have recommendations which are really going to deal with any of the problems, right? So for instance, this idea of trust and build trust with the police. The problem isn't that communities don't trust the police. The problem is the police, right? You actually need to sort out the police so that people can trust them. And a whole kind of a big thing that goes behind a lot of this is we just need to fix our attitudes, be happier, ignore racism. I mean, even the Black women are being 4 times more likely to die in childbirth is named in the report. And then they say, oh yeah, but don't make too much of it because it's going to make people scared. Well, people should rightly be scared because it's a terrible issue, right? So if you look, a lot of these recommendations are actually more about just us having a better attitude rather than actually trying to deal with the problem. And then there are some really deeply problematic ideas. And I just give you recommendation 19, undertake a support for families review. One of the bullet points of this reads, we need academic research into cultural attitudes and parenting styles, which may be distinct within ethnic communities and what role they play in shaping life outcomes. And the fact that this is 2021 and that stuff's being written and published, I mean, that should really frighten us, because I thought we'd abandoned that cultural racism a long time ago. So yeah, this is...
Kehinde, you need to go back to that recommendation. I hope you don't mind just coming back to that, because it's a really important one. What they've said is, families need to look at cultural things within themselves to explain the disproportionate outcomes. So it's really, really dangerous. They're saying those disproportionate outcomes, which are actually the outcomes of structural racism, are to do with your family and my family and the individual family, rather than the system and the structure. It's actually quite a clever report, I would say. Not a dangerously lazy one, because it's trying to shift the responsibility away from collective responsibility back onto families and individuals and all those lazy families, whoever they may be. Because if you're not doing well, because guess what, that good immigrant over there is doing well, but your family isn't doing well. So look within, rather than asking the system to be accountable for those large scale outcomes that we see and those statistics that you mentioned. See, it's really clever. It's not dangerously lazy.
Yeah.
And Kemi, you asked the question, what did you think of the recommendations?
So, sorry, I unleashed a can of worms there. Apologies, everyone. I didn't mean to bring you back to that point where you first picked up the report and got angry, as I did. The more I read it, the angrier and angrier I got. What did I think of the recommendations? Well, my thoughts were really about all the other race reports, race and inequality reports that have been written, and how little of the recommendations were ever implemented. And I wondered if any of the recommendations were good enough to be implemented, and when they would be implemented, and if they would make any difference. So I really was interested to hear what the other panelists thought of the rest of them.
There is one recommendation, which ironically I agree with, which is their final recommendation, which is use data in a responsible and informed way. All right, and you can't argue against that. Whether they use the data in a responsible and informed way is another question. But yeah, there is data out there and we definitely need to use it. And if we use it in a responsible and informed way, we will find out that there is structural racism, and we will discover that there are ways to address it. So I don't agree with how they are using data, but the idea of using data in a responsible and informed way, can't argue against that. We've got the data, let's use it. Let's shape policies to actually address structural racism.
Marcus, the point about data is also that we don't collect the data. So somebody asked, what would Runnymede recommend? One of our first recommendations is to make it mandatory to collect ethnicity data across the whole kind of spheres. At the moment, we don't do that. So even with COVID death certificates, that actually we didn't collect the data. So where it exists, use it, but actually take a step back, collect it. Because if you collect the data on stop and search, for example, you will see a reduction, by the way, on police officers stopping Black and Asian men in traffic lights. So we actually don't collect enough ethnicity disaggregated data. Once you've got it, use it really well.
No, I couldn't. In my area, BBC, Channel 4, ITV, Channel 5, Netflix cannot tell you the ethnicity of the people who actually make their programs.
Because it's not mandatory, is it?
It's not mandatory, and they do not collect nor publish that data. And yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with you. And that's just my area, so I'm sure it's in other sectors as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, the area that I work in is food poverty and food insecurity, and I've been pushing for years for measurement of food poverty and food insecurity across the board. Who are the people who are experiencing this? What is their income and why? But of course, once you record this information, once you have it there, then you have to do something about it. And no one wants to do anything about it. And that's why the measurement never gets done. Sorry, I've given that your everything back to you. Sorry, Nandini. I'm sorry.
No worries, no worries. I'm glad for the conversation to be flowing. But yeah, we're definitely not going to get through everyone's questions anyway, but I can try. There was another one here, and I don't know the answer to this. It says, is there anything that can be done to have this report basically officially struck off because of the disingenuous findings? Does anyone know in terms of processes?
What's the question? Like, could we officially get it struck off?
Yeah, is there a way that this report could be officially struck off because of the disingenuous findings?
Yeah, I think, look, we've had a couple of lawyers approach us to say, do you want a legal challenge about this? And we're always thinking, no, we've got other things to be focused on now. But clearly there is a contingent out there that believes that it's so discredited that there needs to be some kind of legal way to get it struck out. But I think that's a role for other people. What we have said in our open letter, we very carefully drafted it, by the way. It wasn't something that we did in a hush and a rush just so that we could express our anger. It was very well thought out, because we thought there was something there around the fact that most academics quickly jumped up and said, we didn't sign up to that, because they're essentially saying our names were used in a piece of report that doesn't reflect our integrity. Well, if that is the case, then the commissioners who basically agreed to use their names need to say that there was a process that doesn't seem to have any integrity. And that actually challenges any notion of academic freedom in the UK, doesn't it? If you have this report lying around, the notion of academic freedom must be flawed in this country, because we don't seem to have academic excellence. So I do think for this reason, the Prime Minister needs to repudiate it, hence the hashtag reject the report. But I think we need to distance ourselves formally from it. It doesn't have a legal status, as you know, because it's independent. But I think we are in this symbolic space, aren't we? We have to repudiate it to say it has no integrity. That's why we're going for the open letter, to ask the Prime Minister to repudiate it.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I guess, yeah, there's some final few questions here. What, and this is for anyone really, what can people of colour who feel gaslighted, angry and disheartened do to feel okay? How can we challenge the government's denial in our daily lives? Does anyone know?
I mean, one of the things is, like, this is a reflection of this government, and this government has told you time and again where they stand on issues of race. So it shouldn't be a surprise. And actually, my actual honest personal response to this was I really laughed and said, this is awful. It's worse than I thought it could possibly have been. But I haven't actually got angry about it, because this is what was always going to be some version of this, right? And so what we should do is continue doing the work that we've always been doing, which is building community, building organization, resisting. And in some ways, this report shouldn't change any of it. We need to do it anyway, and we should just carry on doing what we've been doing.
Resist and revolt, someone's written in the chat. Any other views on that? No, that's okay. Okay, and I guess final question for now is specifically about white people. Again, to anyone on the panel, what can they actually do? Do you have any advice on what white people can do to be meaningful allies?
Just gonna, I asked this question to my white majority friends on Facebook, and yesterday, and that was very interesting what they said, but mainly about challenging themselves and checking their own behavior. In the end, like 4 of them ganged up against one of the other ones who just said that that everyone should be colorblind, because obviously that's a notion that doesn't really work. But I think for myself, I would just ask that they listen and don't belittle my experiences, or don't belittle any Black, brown person's experiences, and take into account that what they might think is the truth is not actually, it's not my reality.
Great, thank you. Nice summary. Any other final points?
Not to get all religious on you, but basically in terms of what can white people do, I would say do unto others as you would have others do unto you. You know, in that if you saw a report which blamed you as a white person and your culture for why you are not achieving educationally, if you found yourself in situations where they're saying that somehow you are more stupid than everyone else, right? That somehow you deserve not to have equal pay. If somehow, you know, if you ever find yourself in that position, you would not be happy, right? And so similarly, if you're finding that Black and brown people or any group in society are in that position, right, then you need to say, if I wouldn't be happy with that for myself, right, why on earth do I think other people, why do I think that Black people should be happy with that, right? And so, as I said, it's really basic. It's what you learn at Sunday school, or what is across all different religions and philosophies. Just do unto others as you'd have others do unto you, you know, and it's as simple as that.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up now, and I'm really sorry about that, and I know we didn't get through all the questions, but thank you so much, everyone, for joining the debate, and to all the panelists and to our audience. Thank you to Kehinde, Kemi, Halima and Marcus. Please, everyone, give them a big round of applause from your bedrooms and living rooms and kitchens and so on, even though they can't hear you. Follow them all on Twitter, buy their books, read their reports as alternatives to this government report. And I feel very honoured that we've got to hear from these great thinkers today. So we have a weekly debate. You can check out our website and our social media and check out the details, or go to opendemocracy.net/live discussions. And we have a weekly newsletter. And Open Democracy relies on contributions and donations. So if you want to see more public interest journalism like this, please do support us. And you can do that by going to support.opendemocracy.net/donate. And thank you all, and see you next week, I hope.